Hi, so here is our last two for one takeaway. Our first takeaway for this one is that the Machiavellian view, the ends justify the means, is used by international corporations to justify behavior that is not with their US corporate codes of conduct. The actions taken by the multinational corporations may be legal in the country that they are operating in. However, this approach can lead to corrupt practices in direct conflict with the company's stated moral values and have significant negative impacts on human rights, environmental integrity, and social equity. So, with this first takeaway, it's kind of funny. Colleen and I had very similar takeaways mentioning this Machiavellian view, the ends justify the means. And in the chapter, The Legal and Ethical Environment for Multinational Corporations, we had to read this week, it showed how multiple corporations will justify their final business decisions overseas by any means to deliver the most profits to their shareholders. These types of actions have come up throughout the quarter in examples, including the Nike example. At first, they were using subcontractors that actually had child labor to produce their products. And they actually didn't think it was their responsibility because they weren't actually employing children. In the end, people who were purchasing their products actually stopped and encouraged them to change because of all this negative pressures. And now they've really taken their responsibility to the next level and actually look at other developing countries and ensure that they're not using that Machiavellian view that ends justify the means. The Walmart article this week also explained how Walmart used bribery in Mexico and other countries to build over archaeological sites, even though their executives touted their high ethical values and morals in the United States. Both of these companies had CSRs, an ethical code of conduct for how they viewed their businesses running in the United States, but initially neglected to see the negative impacts that they had on the countries they were employing work, including destroying history, taking advantage of child labor, or even allowing their company to continue to make unethical decisions that eventually even hurt their shareholders and consumers that purchase their products. Josh, Colleen, did you have anything to add to this takeaway?
No, I think you summed it up perfectly, Adriana.
Perfect. Well, here's Josh to talk about our second takeaway.
Yeah, I think we can just jump into the second takeaway. So, our second takeaway is that many developing countries do not have the governmental agencies and resources to enforce social responsibility for large companies. And this is an excellent opportunity for U.S. companies to apply their CSRs to benefit these societies. Unfortunately, the readings from this week highlight several companies that took advantage of this situation despite the potential consequences of investigative costs, lawsuits from shareholders, and the negative impacts to the corporation's reputation. And so, as Adriana mentioned and discussed during the first takeaway, I think and throughout the class, there have been countless examples of companies kind of exploiting developing countries to either gain an edge or increase their profits. And some of these have had some real dire consequences. However, last week in class, we discussed that there are companies that have CSRs that they truly believe in and implement them. And we discussed a couple of the U.S. companies. However, it appears that the U.S. is kind of behind the curve compared to the European countries, such as Unilever and others, where they actually implement their CSRs. And so, as we were kind of talking about the negative aspect and that companies really do have CSRs, we thought that this might be, we really wanted to highlight in this takeaway that this is an opportunity for businesses to not have a negative experience doing business overseas, but can kind of use the model of lobbying for good and really implement their CSRs while they're doing work overseas and help benefit either, the social, have a big impact on social, environmental, other impacts in the society. And so I think this kind of also leads to our our outstanding question that I'll hand off to Colleen to discuss.
Thanks, Josh. So Josh actually came up with this question, and while I was reading through it, I was instantly curious about it. And the question is, what percentage of Fortune 500 companies apply their CSR values while doing business abroad? Is there a correlation between the size of a multinational corporation and their tendency to use resources to exploit laws and regulations abroad? So in the reading this week, as Adriana and Josh mentioned, there are multiple references of companies doing the exact opposite of applying their corporate social responsibility when doing business abroad, including the examples of Walmart, Texaco, and also Enron from previous readings. So these huge corporations took advantage of their positions of power and extensive financial and legal resources and used international laws or lack of laws and various levels of enforcement in these host countries to drive profits for their companies. So on the other hand, as we're discussing ethical companies in class, many of the more ethical companies that we thought of and brought up were much smaller in size. So some examples were Tom's, Patagonia. We were looking up international companies, and Warby Parker is another company that I think they make glasses and they distribute glasses to poor people in developing countries, similar to how Tom's sends a pair of shoes to kids in developing countries as well. So these small companies, we're thinking about it, seem to have a lot more of an ethical stance in these larger corporations. So it brought up the second part of the question: is there a correlation between size and tendency to be ethical or unethical in international business? So another question I brought up is it because we just don't hear about smaller companies because they are small and they don't create as much of a swirl in the media? Or is it because they play by the rules more than larger companies? So I think in order to answer this unanswered question, it'd be really interesting to have a third party, maybe like McKinsey or another large consulting firm, to do research to determine what countries have encountered international scandals or have shown unethical behavior, and compare that to the size of the companies. So if the results show that a company increases its likelihood of acting against its corporate values as it extends its international presence, maybe it's in the best interest of the leaders of those companies to set up regulatory sectors as they're expanding to kind of offset this, I guess, temptation to act unethically as they grow internationally.
And Colleen, as you were talking about that, just one thing kind of crossed my mind as we used the example last week of European and the U.S. companies kind of being behind the curve and the European countries being a little bit better with their CSRs. It might be interesting to also see if European countries have better track records of applying their CSRs when doing work internationally or in developing countries.
Yeah, definitely. I'd be super curious to see what that answer is. And with that, that's the end of our final 2+1 takeaways.